You know what's weird? Cartoon channels. Outside of wrestling, they're pretty much the only channels that have a definitive time period for their content. They're also one of the only types of channels where you could get into an argument over what the best time period was for them. And that sounds fun, so let's do it. Hello everyone and welcome back to the Void Theater. As always, I'm your ghostly host, Alexander Shade, and let's talk about this. So, it shouldn't be a surprise that when I'm talking about cartoon channels, I'm mainly talking about the big three. Those being Nickelodeon, Cartoon Network, and of course, Disney. Okay, so before we start, a few things just to make this a bit easier to understand. First, just to clarify, this is going to be a focus on when the networks were at their best in terms of animated television content. If we're to count stuff like movies, then this video will focus far too much on Disney, and I refuse to give that mouse any more power than he already has. Secondly, this is not going to be a competition between the channels, but more of a retrospect on them. Thirdly, any and all subsidiaries of the main channel will be taken into account. So that includes Nicktoons for Nickelodeon, Toon Disney and Jetix for Disney, and Boomerang, Adult Swim, and Toonami for Cartoon Network. I'm also going to allow Cartoon Network to count some of the shows from Kids WB and 4Kids in their lineup, since most of the shows that were on those two channels migrated over to CN anyway, but only if they actually made it before being cancelled. So shows like Batman, Batman Beyond, Justice League, Johnny Test, and anything like that are fair game. The same goes for anything that both Nickelodeon and Disney took from or added to their channels. Fourth, this should go without saying, but these are all my personal opinions. So if you agree, that's fine, and if you don't, that's just great. Leave a comment down below and let me know what you think of each channel. I'm actually pretty curious to see how different the results are going to end up being. And finally, if you do like the video or topic, please remember to like and subscribe for more content like this. It helps the channel pop up on the algorithm and more importantly, lets me know what type of content to keep producing. So, now that we've gotten all the rules and regulations out of the way, we can begin. And without further ado, let's put these channels on stage and see how they play out. Alright, so we'll take this easiest to hardest, and unfortunately that means that Nick is the first on the chopping block. And if you're a fan of Avatar, well then you're really not going to like this part. But let me explain and maybe you'll see where I'm coming from. So Nick is fairly easy because Nick has a frankly terrible track record of animated programs from the last decade or so. And it's pretty easy to see where they kind of fell off the map and where they really did start to peak. And that was the 90s for the peak and the 2010s for the fall. Now, when it comes to the 90s, it gets rather complicated to talk about them without it seeming like there's some overwhelming nostalgia for that period. But I actually don't have a dog in this fight. I was born around the end of the 90s, and most of what I saw were reruns of the Nick classics. Most of the shows that I grew up on were things like El Tigre, My Life as a Teenage Robot, and Avatar The Last Airbender. But that being said, I do think it is kind of telling that even Nick themselves seem to think that they peaked around the end of the 90s, considering they had an entire channel block dedicated to running exclusively 90s content that ran for 4 years. I think it's safe to say it's a pretty safe bet that they knew where they peaked at. But that does bring up something else, or rather two something. See, the main defense you would see online for the later parts of Nick's cartoon runs are SpongeBob and Fairly OddParents. You could also include Danny Phantom, but let's just group that one with Fairly OddParents and Butch Hartman. But the issue with that is, if I'm going to obey the rules I set out earlier, then SpongeBob falls into the 90s category. Just barely, but a technicality is a technicality, so into the 90s he goes. Now then, let's talk about Fairly OddParents, Danny Phantom, and Butch Hartman. I promise Avatar is coming up, but that one's going to require some serious explanation, so just hold on for a minute. See, you can't really talk about Nick without mentioning Butch Hartman. The man is one of the staples of the channel and one of the main reasons that Nick climbed in popularity so fast. Now, with all that being said, let's be honest. Most of his shows went down the damn drain. Danny Phantom was canceled before they could actually try to fix the mess that Phantom Planet caused, and Fairly OddParents went on so long that even the most dedicated fans couldn't be bothered to keep up with it. You kinda know when you're on a downward slope when you not only introduce a baby and a dog into the show, but both the fans and the writers try their hardest to repress them. But I'm nothing if not a fair ghost, so I will say that the same argument can be said for SpongeBob. Though I would counter-argue that SpongeBob has at least made attempts to try and make solid episodes again. So instead of one good episode for every 10 bad, we now have one good for every 5. It's progress. It's not a lot of progress, but it's progress. But on the other side, you can't really make that same argument for Fairly OddParents and Danny Phantom. Both shows went downhill and were then abruptly cancelled. But it wasn't just them. Pretty much every Nickelodeon cartoon at the time was either ignored, forgotten, or abruptly cancelled. So it becomes pretty complicated to say that the mid-2000s had anything to offer simply because they were never given the opportunity to. But I'm sidetracking here, and let's be honest. If we're going to talk about Nickelodeon, we can't not talk about Avatar The Last Airbender. Arguably Nick's second most iconic show, next to SpongeBob, of course. And by now, most people know that when you mention the show, you expect some long-winded speech about how Avatar is one of the greatest shows ever made, and thus renders any argument for the time period it came out in to be the best one. Here's the thing though. I'm not going to do that. Why? Because there's literally dozens, if not hundreds of videos on YouTube doing the exact same thing. It's not a new idea. If I'm being completely fucking honest, it's not even original. Everyone knows the show is good. It's Avatar. But the argument is, one amazing show does not save a bad decade. Again, I'm not denying that Avatar is outstanding. It clearly is. It's just that everything around it was, to be kind, less than stellar. Never forget that at the same time Avatar was running, Mr. Meaty was also airing at the same time. So it's more like Avatar was the shining beacon of talent among a sea of mediocrity, then every show around that time was good, and Avatar was just that much better. Also, if you're wondering when I'm going to talk about the 2010s, I'm not going to. The only things in that time period worth watching were Harvey Beaks and Legend of Korra, and one died about 2 seasons in, and the other was mistreated by Nick the day it came out. That being said, if you are interested in Harvey Beaks, I covered it in a previous vid, so be sure to check that out if you want to know my thoughts on that. The link to the video will be in the description below and in the upper right hand corner. So yeah, as much as I love Avatar, El Tigre, and My Life as a Teenage Robot, I gotta give it to the 90s Nickelodeon. Alright, so that's 1 down, 2 to go. So let's move on to the mouse who will one day own us all and talk about Disney. Now, if Nick was easy mode, then Disney is right up there in medium difficulty. They don't really have one stand out bad, and they don't really have one stand out good. They're just perfectly balanced, as all things should be. But I'm still going to try and find one that rises above the others. Why? Because screw the balance. So just like with Nick, let's start at it with the early 90s. And just because I want to be equal in how I piss people off, I'm going to make a bold statement here. I never got into Gargoyles. Now look, I can acknowledge that the show is considered to be one of Disney's best. I accept that. I really do. But I was way too young to remember the show when it originally aired, and by the time the rerun started, I had already fallen into Batman. So I may not be the most qualified to speak on the 90s, but let's be real, that's never stopped any YouTuber before, so why start now? So when it comes to Disney in the 90s, I'd be hard pressed to skip over the impact they had. You had shows like the original DuckTales, Darkwing Duck, and of course Gargoyles. It was a solid lineup at the time and definitely one worth revisiting if you've never seen any of the original shows. But one thing that always bugged me was the lack of diversity with the shows from that time. Not in the actual characters, but more the style of programming. Aside from Gargoyles, most of the shows were pretty much just standard kids cartoons. Stuff that was aimed at a really young audience. It wasn't bad, but it did wear out its welcome if you're not into that type of stuff. And if I'm being completely honest, I genuinely thought DuckTales and Darkwing Duck were part of the same show like Animaniacs and Pinky and the Brain. But to Disney's credit, that was only half of the 90s. Specifically the very early 90s. Though technically DuckTales and Rescue Rangers started airing in the late 80s, but screw it, they ended in the 90s so they count. However, the mid to late 90s are where it gets interesting because that was the time for the Disney movie spin-offs. And most of them were actually pretty solid. Mind you, none of them were really groundbreaking or that overall impressive, but they were enjoyable. You had Aladdin, Hercules, Timon and Pumbaa, and while they were pretty cookie-cutter stuff, I can't say any of them were actively insulting. That being said, there's also not really much to say about them because they were so cookie-cutter. So let's just move on to the 2000s. And it's more movie spin-off shows. Hooray. But I will give them credit where credit is due, they felt much more unique. Shows like Buzz Lightyear of Star Command and Lilo & Stitch felt more like proper extensions or original takes on the movies that they were based on, instead of just side pieces that you could ignore, even if one of them is so hated that it couldn't make it to Disney+. You can't really mention the 2000s of Disney without mentioning their 2 star shows, Kim Possible and Phineas and Ferb, and technically a very special guest, but I'll get to that later. But let's start with Kim Possible, the show that was for the longest time Disney's poster child, pretty much only getting replaced by Phineas and Ferb when they released. But before that, it was safe to assume that when you thought of Disney, you either thought of an all-knowing, power-hungry mouse, or a red-headed teenage superhero. And for good reason. Like Danny Phantom, the show had the ability to appeal to a wide demographic without coming off as cheesy or trying too hard. Teens could enjoy it for the action, and kids could enjoy the humor. But unlike Danny Phantom, Kim Possible never really hit a dry spell, unless you count the live-action movie, which no one should. Throughout its 5-year runtime and 2 movies, the show never really faltered the same way Danny Phantom did in season 3. And it was that consistency that kept the show in good graces even now. But let's move on to Disney's other darling, Phineas and Ferb. And I actually don't have much to say about this show. It's good. It was fun and simple and something solid to watch when you just wanted to chill. Good show. Just a good, fun show. But we still have one more show to deal with before we jump into the 2010s, and that's The Spectacular Spider-Man. Now, because I still have a channel and a half to cover, I'll try to keep this short. Mainly because you could film an entire video with my thoughts on this, and I don't have the time or the patience for that. But to summarize, The Spectacular Spider-Man show is iconic, and is probably the reason a lot of people got into Spider-Man and comics in general. It's a show that's so popular that even after its unjust cancellation, it was still getting traction for a revival in 2019. And there's a lot of strong reasons for that. The show is bright, colorful, and full of great action scenes and strong plot points. Seriously, if you've never seen this show, go watch it. It's like $20 for the Blu-ray on Amazon, and it's well worth the money. Let's wrap up this little trip through the wonderful world of Disney and talk about the 2010s. And we have a lot of stuff to talk about here. I'll save the heavy hitters for near the end, so let's start with the other Marvel shows. We had Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes, which was fantastic at adapting the feel of the MCU while staying true to the comic source. And then we had its sequel, Avengers Assemble, which, while fine in its own right, never really felt like it kept up with the original. But honestly, both were still fun action shows. And then we have the Spider-Man shows Ultimate and Marvel. They were there. They definitely existed and were shows. Ultimate was a fun attempt to introduce some lesser-known superhero characters to an audience who had never seen them before, but Marvel's Spider-Man was just odd. It wasn't good, it wasn't bad, the entire show just felt odd. It also didn't help that Spectacular Spider-Man was still extremely popular, so the show was already starting at a handicap. But, I mean, it tried, right? That's gotta count for something. But let's move back into the main channel and talk about Disney's big three: Amphibia, Gravity Falls, and Owl House. And honestly, I have yet to sit down and fully watch Owl House. I'm aware of the fame it carries, I know the legendary status it holds in terms of Disney shows as a whole, but I just haven't found the time to sit down and really get a good look at the show itself. I also haven't seen Amphibia, but most people don't seem to be focused with that as they do with Owl House, so make of that what you will. Also, I just want to give a quick shout out to Wander Over Yonder. You did not deserve to get treated like Harvey Beaks, and you just deserved so much better than what you got from Disney. But now that I got that out of the way, let's talk about Gravity Falls, Disney's answer to Adventure Time. And again, I really don't have much to say about Gravity Falls, or at least nothing that hasn't already been said. Gravity Falls is a fantastic show, and it's arguably one of Disney's best. But if I do have to say one unique thing about it, it's the fact that the show ended. See, more often than not, there are a lot of animated shows that just wear out their welcome and go on for far too long. So to have a show that actually knows the story it wants to tell and wrap it up with a nice little bow is a really nice welcome change for once. Lord knows plenty of other shows should follow suit. But with that being said, what do I think is the best time period for Disney cartoons? Well, I gotta be honest, this one is a little more complicated than Nick. Whereas that had a very noticeable downward spiral the longer the channel went on, with the exception of certain shows, Disney has always maintained a pretty steady line of decent to good content. Of course, there are always notable exceptions like Marvel's Spider-Man or The Replacements, but overall I gotta give it to Disney. They're nothing if not consistent. But if I had to pick a time frame for them, I would probably give it to the 2010s. There was a lot of variety in terms of the type of shows you could watch and where you could watch them. If you were more a fan of comedic, lighthearted shows, you could stick to Disney Channel, but if you wanted more action-oriented stuff, you could switch over to Disney XD. For a certain period, you could even watch Naruto if you wanted. I mean, it was essentially a 4Kids watered-down version of it, but you could. But yeah, overall, I gotta give it to the 2010s for Disney. Now before we jump into the final channel, I'd like to take a quick intermission to remind you that if you do enjoy what you're seeing today, then please remember to like the video and subscribe for more. As always, any traction helps the channel grow and is greatly appreciated. Now with that being said, let us journey back on into the theater. Alright, so let's round this video off with the big dog themselves and talk about Cartoon Network. And I cannot be more excited for this one, because there's no winning. There's nothing I could say or do that could convince people that one time period is better than the other when it comes to this goddamn channel. But if there's one thing I love, it's a challenge, so let's do this. And this has the added benefit of saving me some time explaining all these shows, since they're all pretty well known. Though I will give some brief descriptions here and there when I feel necessary. So like with the other two, we'll start with the 90s, and off the bat we have some really heavy hitters with the likes of the Powerpuff Girls, Dexter's Lab, and of course, Batman the Animated Series. You see what I mean here when I said there was a serious argument to be made? This is the first decade we're looking at, and it starts off with not only some of the most famous cartoons ever made, but also one of the most iconic superhero shows ever created. And then it doubles down on that by also including its sequel show in the same decade. So off the bat, we have some stiff competition. Now for the third time in the video, I'm going to say this. There's no point going into detail for Batman the Animated Series. It's the same concept as Avatar, except times that by 10 and you get where I'm coming from. This show is one of, if not the definitive version of the character that everyone has talked about 1,000 times over, and I can almost guarantee that anyone watching this video has at least seen some part of it. If by some miracle of God you haven't, go get HBO Max and just watch it. It's worth the price all on its own. However, I will talk about Dexter's Lab because unfortunately it did suffer through the same fate that Fairly OddParents and Danny Phantom did, in that it started to go off the rails as the series continued. The later seasons ended up a lot more hit and miss compared to the earlier seasons, but that could be chalked up to Genndy Tartakovsky leaving to work on another show. One that we'll definitely be getting into later. Then you have the Powerpuff Girls, which despite its current standing with the reboot and whatever the live action series was a cultural phenomenon. Both shows were crucial in cementing Cartoon Network as the go-to place for animation entertainment, and unlike Dexter, the Powerpuff Girls never really lost their stride as the show went on. Also, I'm just going to rip this band-aid off now. Get real used to hearing the names Craig McCracken and Genndy Tartakovsky, because those two have their handprints over damn near every decade of Cartoon Network, and are arguably the main reason the channel grew into the juggernaut it is. But let's continue our journey and take a look at the 2000s. And again, we have some real strong shows here, and a pretty diverse amount of them too. Shows like Samurai Jack, Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends, and even the original Ben 10 were all created around this time and all filled a real niche for people. You had a nice slice of life with Foster's, a gritty action drama with Samurai Jack, and a sci-fi epic with Ben 10. Not to mention the other shows like Kids Next Door, Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy, Chowder, and The Marvelous Misadventures of Flapjack. And if you were that weird kid, Totally Spies. Things were good. Until they weren't. Now, remember back when I was talking about Avatar and I said one great show can't save an era of mediocrity? Well, with an entire block of live action shows on a Cartoon Network, you can certainly sink an era of good to great shows. So for a very brief moment, let's talk about CN Real. Now, I know none of these are cartoons, but this entire chunk of Cartoon Network was pretty critical for its development, and despite many great shows coming out around this time, CN Real kind of overshadowed them and for a long time was thought to have been the Cartoon Network killer. And these shows were terrible. Well, most of them anyway. I actually really liked Destroy Built Destroy, but it wasn't Cartoon Network and they all really dragged the channel down and nearly drove it off TV for good. So I digress. Point is, it should come as no surprise that the shows were canned on an average of about 4 months for each and largely forgotten. So yeah, the 2000s were the definition of a great start, but a terrible finish. But we can't keep pushing it off forever, so let's journey into the 2010s. You know, I could have made this easy for myself. I could have just said that the 2010s were the best, and 9 times out of 10, no one would have argued with me. I mean, it would be hard to. The 2010s are seen as the golden age of Cartoon Network, its glorious rebirth, the renaissance of the once great channel. And it's not hard to see why. The shows that came out during this time are iconic and realistically will be for years to come. Shows like Adventure Time, Regular Show, Steven Universe, and Gumball haven't just aired on Cartoon Network, they've become synonymous with the brand itself. And it's not hard to see why. They are fundamentally good shows. Steven Universe may have needed some time in the oven maybe, but the point is that these shows came out and showed that Cartoon Network not only knew talent and potential when they saw it, they also knew how to make it work for their benefit. Unfortunately, this is also a double-sided coin because this was an acquired skill that came at the cost of some unfortunate cancellations. Shows like Symbionic Titan, Young Justice, and the 2011 Thundercats reboot were unfortunately cut before they really had the opportunity to stretch their legs. Though Young Justice was brought back on HBO Max, so maybe we'll get the conclusion of Symbionic Titan someday. By the way, this also doesn't include shows like Primal, also done by Genndy Tartakovsky, which is just fantastic all on its own. Go watch it. That's all I'm saying on that. So with that being said, what is Cartoon Network's best decade? And in my honest opinion, I gotta give it to the 2010s again. Now, I know I just said that choosing the 2010s will be a cop-out, but let me explain myself. See, when I first started writing the script, honestly when I had the first idea for this video, I knew what I was going to pick for Nick. A day later, I knew where I fell when it came to Disney. As of the time of this recording, I was still unsure where I was going to land for Cartoon Network, and it's not really hard to see why. With Nick, it was easy to see where they just realized they peaked. And with Disney, it was an almost constant stream of okay shows with some really great ones. But with Cartoon Network, it's more like a constant stream of great shows. Now don't get me wrong, there are definitely some bad ones, but they're so outshined by the good that they barely register. And that's not even mentioning the massive impact Adventure Time had on animation as a whole. Hell, Cartoon Network and Disney are still trying to recapture that lightning in a bottle, and they just barely come close with Gravity Falls, Owl House, and Steven Universe. And while those shows did get extremely popular, they never did get to that level because when it comes to animation in the 2010s, Adventure Time didn't just reinvent the wheel, it made the whole damn car. And when you consider the fact that all the shows that followed after on Cartoon Network were essentially byproducts of its creation, it's not really hard to see why I had to give it to the 2010s. But with that, we close the curtains on this Void Theater video. You know, I actually really enjoy looking at stuff like this. It's always fun to take apart a show and see what makes it tick, but there's just something different about taking apart an entire channel and seeing the highs and lows. And when it comes to Nick, Disney, and Cartoon Network, there's always a lot to talk about because they've been running for so long. And yes, I know I didn't cover every possible show for each respective channels, but I do think I took a good look at the ups and downs and tried to paint a pretty good picture and give some solid reasoning on my thoughts. But as always, with the current closing on this video, I like to leave you all with some questions. Or in this case, one question. What are your picks for the best and worst time periods for Cartoon Network, Nickelodeon, and Disney respectively? Leave a comment down below and try and give some reasons. I'm sure there'll be some interesting ones for each one. And while you're down there, be sure to like the video and subscribe for more content on the way. I'll probably end up doing a part 2 at some point, talking about their worst periods respectively. But until then, I've been your ghostly host, Alexander Shade, and I hope to see you back in my theater.